Presentation of dialogue on Idaho Public Television is made possible through the generous support of the Laura Moore Cunningham Foundation, committed to fulfilling the Moore family's legacy of building the great state of Idaho.
Coming up, she opened the door and police took her mother away. Her father was already in prison. More than a generation later, author Kati Marton was able to open the files kept by the Hungarian government on her parents and discover the secrets even they didn't know. That's Dialogue next. Stay tuned. Hello and welcome to Dialogue. I'm Marcia Franklin. By any account, Kati Marton has led a charmed life. She grew up in upscale Chevy Chase, Maryland, became a successful journalist traveling the world, and was married to both Peter Jennings and Ambassador Richard Holbrooke. But as a child, Marton lived through nearly 2 years of terror when her parents were imprisoned by the secret police in Hungary. They were reporters for American news outlets during the Cold War. The family was able to eventually escape the country and come to America. But mum was the word from her parents about their past. After their death, Marton, by then a well-known author, decided to research her parents' story. In doing so, she discovered much about herself as well. The resulting book, Enemies of the People, was Marton's 7th work. I spoke with her about the experience at the 2011 Sun Valley Writers Conference. Since 1995, the conference has been bringing together insightful writers and artists to discuss issues of the day. I started by asking Marton how she picks the topics for her books. How do you choose your topics? You have some eclectic subjects, but in the end, do you feel like your choices have some underlying themes?
I think so. I mean, that's a very good question, but yes, I mean, I like to tackle history through human beings. This last one, Enemies of the People. It tries to convey what the Cold War was like on a very human level, namely through my childhood and through my parents. But really, if I think about it, all my books are history through a single actor. My first book, biography of Raoul Wallenberg, is the Holocaust in Hungary in this instance. I portray that era through this one extraordinary man, this Swedish diplomat who was actually sent to Budapest by President Roosevelt in an attempt to kind of make his record vis-a-vis the Jews look a little bit better. So, and all the others, I mean, the Polk Conspiracy is a Cold War thriller through the eyes of an American journalist, George Polk, who was caught in the middle, and Death in Jerusalem, the birth of the State of Israel through this Swedish diplomat who was assassinated on the eve of his peace plan. So I think I've just identified what I hadn't actually thought about this before, but I think that history, quite frankly, is too important to be left to historians. I think that we need the human fabric, we need the human accounts, and it's very important that we get eyewitness participants' testimonies before too late. I could not today write Enemies of the People because so many of the actors I interviewed are no longer with us. I did journalism for a long time, and I don't think I could go back to that because I love the luxury of long form and telling stories and making it as timeless as I possibly can. So this story, Enemies of the People, is not going to change because I think most of my books take place 50 or more years ago. So you can make some judgments, you can formulate some permanent views on those events.
You've also said that you're trying to connect people with the past in some instances that should ring a warning bell for people.
Absolutely.
To remind people what can happen again.
Well, you know, Marcia, the sad thing is that we're moving, all of us, at such a clip now, and our attention span seems to me to be diminishing every year.
Twitter.
Yes, and you know, books really take a lot of thought. A lot of it's a very lonely business, writing, because you really, nobody else can do it for you, and it takes years to write a good book because it isn't just one person's opinion. I didn't go into this business because I felt that the world was just waiting to hear my every impulse. I went into journalism because, first of all, it was what my parents did, and they were the greatest role models, but also because I'm very curious about the way the world operates, and I think it's really because of my own extremely dramatic childhood, which is the fabric of this story. I have a feeling that that Americans particularly need to have a deeper sense of history, because history, particularly since 9/11, now 10 years ago, has really barged right into our front door, and we can't escape it.
I want to talk in a moment about enemies of the people, but I did want to ask you about one other theme that seems to run through your books, and that is the theme of that one person or one individual can really make a big difference. Raoul Wallenberg, your parents, the Jews that you describe in The Great Escape, that really changed the world because they were able to live.
I'm totally persuaded of that fact, that people are the shapers of history. It's my husband Richard Holbrooke was one. Certainly my mother and father, who really didn't bend to the most vicious systems. My parents were victims of the two worst inventions of the 20th century, that is to say, fascism and communism, and they stood up to both. They emerged not only as survivors, but with all their dignity intact. And so one of the things that I wanted to explore in this book is how did they do that, and what qualities does it take to not be destroyed by forces beyond your control? How to preserve your humanity? That's really what I'm after. What is it that makes some people, that enables some people? Thank God for the rest of us. Where do they get that courage? And throughout this process, I'm always asking myself, how would I behave under similar situations?
Let's talk about the situation, because it's an amazing story. It recounts your incredible opportunity to look into the secret files that the Hungarian communist government had amassed on your parents, who, as you said, were journalists, and even on you and your sister.
Yes.
And there's such an irony in the fact that the files, which are just really disturbing, at the same time gave you this window to understand your parents, who really had tried to put a lot of their past. Your parents were imprisoned,
Yes.
and then had also escaped the Holocaust
Yes.
prior to that. And you got to learn about them and admire them even more, ironically, by seeing these files.
You know, Marcia, I was warned off this project. I was told that I was making a big mistake, that you shouldn't go into secret police files, particularly since both my parents had recently passed away and they wouldn't be able to answer questions. And Hungarians particularly are very leery of opening that Pandora's box. But I was really in search of my parents, who were way too secretive, and they, in a sense, had too much history, and I didn't have enough. My parents were very patriotic Americans, and they considered America the greatest country in the world, and they didn't really see why I needed to go back there. But of course, I think every child, this is the universal theme, really, of Enemies of the People, is that children have a right to know. They have a right to their own history. And I think my parents made a mistake in withholding so much. And there were moments in this process when I was reading these files. It turned out that the Marton family files were among the biggest ones in the archives.
Because your parents had been reporters, they had associated with Americans.
Yes, they in effect, my parents were working for the enemy in the eyes of the communists, in the eyes of Moscow, who was really running Hungary in my childhood, by working for American news agencies. My father, Associated Press, my mother, United Press International. They were, in effect, the last independent media behind the Iron Curtain. And insofar as America knew something about what was going on behind the Iron Curtain, it was largely due to my parents. And so obviously they were figures of great suspicion and ultimately had to be done away with, and that is the kind of hinge event of my childhood was when they finally came for my parents, and I could never really understand how my parents, who had two little girls, myself and my older sister, could take on work that was so obviously risky, and not think that eventually we children would be left alone. And that day came. And
when they were taken away from you?
Yes. In fact, I opened the door to my mother's jailers, and they lied to me, and they said that they were electricians who'd come at my mother's call, and for a long time, really until recently, I had guilt feelings about that particular incident, because I called out my mother's name, and she didn't come. She was on the phone, and I went back to my room. I was playing with another girl who the files revealed had been with me that day as part of the conspiracy to keep me calm and occupied, because these arrests were meant to proceed very quietly and calmly. And so I went back to my room, and about a half hour later, the apartment seemed extremely quiet, and so I ran out of my room and started calling out my mother's name, and there was no mother. And for a long time, I felt that there was a part of me that didn't believe these guys were electricians. They didn't look it. They were too burly. They were secret police agents, of course, wearing workers' overalls.
So you felt guilty for a long time.
The way kids.
How did living under such an oppressive government, now you didn't know at the time that all these people were spying on you, but there was a sense, and then of course your nanny eventually you found out was.
The shock of discovering that our closest circle of friends and employees were informing on us. That, in a way, I'm glad that my parents aren't alive to read that, because I don't think they knew the full extent of the betrayals.
And I won't ruin it for people to read the book about who was the ultimate betrayer. But I was curious to know how living under that system affected you eventually growing up in the United States. Was it harder for you to trust?
I'm a very trusting person. I'm also a very optimistic, positive person.
And your parents were too.
Yes, and I owe them that. They were extremely forward-looking. And I wouldn't be sitting here if that were not the case. I wouldn't be the author of 7 books if I felt that damaged by this. But for sure, I have very sharp survival instincts.
Sure.
I think Hungarians have to, because I came to this country speaking no English. We came with 4 suitcases and nothing else, and my parents were already in their 40s at the time, so we really had to absolutely restart our lives, and did so because of this survival thing. This was the second nightmare for them that they survived. As I mentioned, they also survived the Nazis, and they were. For some reason, my parents have always been on the wrong side of every European conflict. With the Nazis, it was their Jewish background. They were not religious people at all. One of the many secrets that I discovered late in life was that I was of Jewish background, because I was raised as a Roman Catholic. And
so parallels with Madeleine Albright.
In a way, I don't want to get into all the differences there, but
finding out a little bit later.
Yes.
I just have to mention an aside for people in this region, and that was that when your parents were taken away, one of the things you found out in the files was that there was a couple from Salt Lake City.
Yes.
Who wrote and got a message all the way through saying that they would adopt you and your sister. And you had the rare opportunity, speaking of talking to people still alive, once you found that in the files, to call them, to contact them.
Yeah, this is the picture, by the way, that they saw on the front page of the New York Times. And that's that adorable little chubby girl is me. Nothing's changed. And
you're not chubby.
Maybe my hair's a little better. But they wrote a letter to the Secretary of State of the day, John Foster Dulles, asking how can we, both my parents were in prison, obviously for very long prison sentences, how can we adopt these little girls? And of course they got completely caught up in the bureaucracy of the State Department, which is not an adoption agency. So, but I am now in touch with this lovely couple. And yesterday when I was in Salt Lake City, didn't get out of the airport, but I kept thinking, oh, I wonder if I'd have time to go and call on these. They're very elderly now, but to me, this was what Americans were about. You know, people with huge hearts and you know, reaching across the ocean to two strange little girls, and they wanted to make us part of their family. I could have grown up in Utah, Mormon.
And in fact, some other Americans really helped save you as well. So it's
the Americans come off really well in this book, for the most part.
For the most part.
Yes, we don't want to give away the real villain of this piece, but it's I mean, this process of research had many shocks for me.
I want to ask you just a couple other questions here about the book. How you mentioned your parents were on the wrong side of history, but they also got to see, when your dad got out, both your mom and your dad, what was so amazing for me as a journalist is they said, okay, I'm out now, I'm going to keep reporting.
Yes, back to the same job that got them in prison.
And your father reported on the 1956 revolution, and you got to see what was going on. And so I really wanted to ask you how witnessing this revolution, which ultimately failed, but you know, how that continued to affect you for the rest of your life, to see that human spirit coming alive.
Yes. Well, that was, apart from my parents' arrest and obviously the almost 2 years that I didn't see my father, a year without my mother, then no sooner were they freed than the Hungarian Revolution erupted. So those events are obviously the marking events in my life. And no question that I became a journalist because I wanted to continue to be on the front line of history. Yes, not only witnessing, but writing about it. And now I write about it in slightly deeper and longer form than as a journalist. But I have witnessed a number of historic events since then, but none were as emotionally connective to me. I mean, witnessing the Arab Spring, you know, revolutions all have things in common, and especially spontaneous popular uprisings. That has brought back those, you know, this is 50 plus years now, and I was a little kid, but it was hugely marking for me, and it was the first time I saw dead people. And then we went into hiding when the Russians came back. And again, it was the Americans who hit us and ultimately helped to spirit us out.
One last question, because we're rapidly running out of time already, about this book is, you wanted people as well, as I understand it, to remember the Cold War era and the damage that it created, to not forget that.
You know, history is not an academic exercise. History is what we're living. It's sometimes hard to tell that we're living history, but we are. This moment is history, and it's really dangerous for us not to have a sense.
The context.
Yes, it's very dangerous in today's world to again retreat into our own problems, our own domestic problems, which are many. And serious, but I think we need to know how we got here.
Well, some are worried that with increased surveillance after 9/11, that there's some elements of what you depict in this book of government watching that are happening in our own country.
See, I have, you know, call me a cockeyed optimist, but I have such faith in this country's ability to balance itself and to, yes, we go off in extreme directions, but I think we're an extremely rational people, and there's so many different interests at play here. In that corrects any attempt to push us one way or the other. I was in New York City at 9/11, and for sure that was a day that marked me like it marked all of us. seeing, literally seeing in the air the residue of human life for weeks after that. That was, my hometown. So America is not immune from history, and it's really important for us to be familiar with history and not to think that every time a new president comes into the White House, we are reinventing history. We inherit history.
Your late husband was a great believer in what you're talking about too, in studying history, and even encouraging his staff to write down what was happening, as he did. And his biography, I should say, will be written by George Packer, who's also been on this program. But this sense that we need to know the times in which we're living.
Richard was a historian. There were times when I wanted to quit this project because it was too painful, and he would say, "Kati, this isn't just about you. This is you've got to write this because people need to know what it was like, not from an academic point of view, but what was it like to be a little kid whose parents are enemies of the people, so-called, by the state. What did that feel like? What did your friends make you feel as a result of that? What was it like to see your parents being taken away to who knows where? You've got to write this." There were times when I really wanted to stop because some of the discoveries, as you know from having read it, were very disturbing about my parents' personal lives. By the way, it's going to be a motion picture.
Is it? I was going to ask you that.
Yes, and I've got a very good director, screenwriter, etc. So. And
ideas of who you want to play your parents and everything?
I have ideas. Okay. Yes.
All right.
But
well, he encouraged you, and that was a large part of your marriage. You encouraged each other.
Yes.
You were a team. You were partners, and it's probably unfair to ask this question, but when you look at your late husband's legacy and what he left for not only the people who work with him, but for our country, what stands out for you as the overarching legacy?
Well, Marcia, I've been traveling a lot since Richard died 7 months ago, and it's all over the world he's remembered. I mean, there are streets being named after Richard in most European countries. He was seen as the face of the United States, the foreign policy face, because he was a diplomat for 40 years, and he did end the war in the Balkans. I think that what Richard will be remembered for is a kind of diplomacy that is based on one human being at a time. That he was a very good student, not only of history, but of the human psyche and human motives. I mean, I was with him in Dayton when he negotiated the end to that the worst European war since World War II.
And you got to sit with Milosevic.
I did, and these were sociopaths. But Richard identified particularly Milosevic as the key to making peace. And once he got that, the next thing was to identify Milosevic's vulnerabilities as a human being. So Richard was not a poker player; he was a chess player. He could see several moves down the board, and I watched how he maneuvered these guys.
What would he think of the capture of Osama bin Laden, and where would he be going with that right now?
Yes, well, for one thing, I wish he'd lived to see that, because of course that his job would have been much easier. He was, as you know, in charge of President Obama's Afghanistan-Pakistan policy, that is the civilian side. He would have been all over Pakistan in the wake of that,
because that's the crux, isn't it?
It is. The day before 9/11, Richard and I were in Berlin. We were at a lunch with Angela Merkel, the chancellor.
Germany.
And I will never forget this. Richard said, and this was a decade before he was ever given Afghanistan assignment. He told her that Pakistan is hugely important and isn't getting the attention that it should have. So, I mean, in the last 2 years, I never went for a walk with Richard in Central Park without him making a call to somebody in Pakistan or a call coming in. So that would have been saturation coverage from him to try to, because we can't, as mad as we are at the Pakistanis, and it's a complex relationship, we do not have the luxury of not being completely on top of that situation, because it's a very dangerous country.
Both you and he, as we wrap up, were so concerned about human rights issues. And I've read some of his essays from the 1970s, and his focus was on always reminding the powers that be that they have an obligation to rescue the victims.
Yes.
And do you think that comes in part, his parents also escaped the Holocaust?
Yes, his father from Russia, his mother from Germany. I think, it's hard to say where people get these traits. Richard was midway between being a diplomat and a human rights activist, and for him, the military was the last option. He really didn't feel that any war was inevitable, and therefore he really believed in the power of diplomacy. And where he got that, I think in part he got it from Averell Harriman. That's very relevant for
connection to Idaho.
Yes, Harriman was among his first mentors,
and he had a soft spot. Your husband did for Sun Valley because of that, right?
Yes,
which was developed by Averell Harriman.
Yes. I remember the first time we came to the Sun Valley Lodge, Richard took me around and showed me all the old photographs. And
has working on these books, Kati, whether it's been about your parents or Raoul Wallenberg, has it helped you get through this in terms of knowing the strength that they had? I mean, you must derive something from that, from your parents' strength and getting through things from Raoul Wallenberg.
I think so, yeah. It's hard.
It's really, really hard, I'm sure. Well, I'm sure he'll be missed by lots of people, and I want to take the opportunity to thank you for talking to me. Actually, I'll try out my Hungarian with you. Köszönöm szépen.
Nagyon szívesen. And your Hungarian is excellent.
Köszönöm szépen, I believe, means thank you kindly.
Yeah, that's very elegantly put, and nagyon szívesen, which means from my heart. And it's been great talking to you.
Thank you so much, and enjoy your stay here.
Thank you.
You've been listening to author Kati Marton in a conversation taped at the 2011 Sun Valley Writers Conference. I'd like to thank the organizers of that conference and Ms. Marton for finding time in her schedule for this interview. We continued our talk in a web extra, including discussing Marton's next work. To watch that web extra or our other interviews from the Sun Valley Writers Conference over the years, check out our website. For Dialogue, I'm Marcia Franklin. Thanks for tuning in.
Presentation of Dialogue on Idaho Public Television is made possible through the generous support of the Laura Moore Cunningham Foundation, committed to fulfilling the Moore family's legacy of building the great state of Idaho.